As we begin to think about writing in this new, strange context of new media and social media, we're going to be talking with someone who's an expert in this field, who gets to do it day in and day out for their profession. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you Briana Vannozzi, a regional Emmy Award nominated correspondent for NJTV News. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I wanted to start off by asking you, pretty much everyone learns at some point or another how to write for a general academic style. That's how you get through school. What do you think is the main differences between writing for that sort of style as opposed to writing for journalism or media?
When you're writing for any type of journalism platform, you have a much broader audience, and you also have to assume that your audience hasn't necessarily been following that topic as specifically and as narrowly as you have been. So when you're writing an academic paper of any sort, there's a little bit of a strict format that you follow. It looks something like you have an issue, you narrow in on that issue, you immediately write about the solution, and then you're explaining how you got to that. And you are almost giving away the entirety of your paper right from the get-go. Whereas when you're writing for journalism, there's always that narrative arc. There's a story that gradually unfolds. And when you're writing any topic, you have to understand that not everyone is as nuanced as you are. When they're reading about a policy issue, an economic issue, a health issue. So you have to think about your audience in that way and write about it in a way where you may have to remind people about things that have happened in the past. Keep going back to certain elements of the topic, whereas when you're writing those academic papers, you've hit that point, you've talked about the solution, how you got there, and now you move on and you sort of follow that all throughout. In journalism, you want to keep your reader interested. Not that you don't in academic writing, but you have that first graph, that first nugget of information that gives the really meat of the story. But then you need to sort of lure people into wanting to read more or to listen more or to watch more, so that they go to the very end and that they're not tuning out or clicking off of that page within the first couple of seconds.
Which brings me to something that I often consider, and that's, how do you strike that balance between trying to be eye-catching and grab their attention, but not be over-sensationalized or just making up stuff?
Sensationalism, I think, is always going to be an issue. I mean, you can go back and look at the first writings about yellow journalism and how deep that goes. I think what you have to remember when you're writing for journalism is, when you're writing in general, is we talk a lot about being unbiased in our writing. That's almost impossible if you're a human. You really can't be completely unbiased. We have all innately been raised a certain way, been exposed to certain issues and environments that have made us cultured in a way that we believe certain values to be true. We think certain issues may be more important than others. So being completely and utterly unbiased is not possible. However, you can be factual. So if your writing is factual and if you are giving the issues and explaining both sides of what those issues are, you can still make really eye-catching, snappy, punchy headlines and titles and nuggets in your broadcast journalism, or if you're doing radio or podcasts, without being unfactual and without forgetting to present that, hey, I may really feel strongly about this, or this person I'm interviewing may feel strongly about this, but there's someone who feels just as strongly the other way. So making sure that you cite sources, making sure that you're accurately quoting people in whatever platform you're using helps you, so that whatever that story is, it's not just, and we're talking about stories, not just headlines, whatever it is that you're writing is showing both of those sides. And listen, you can still get really creative with your writing. I mean, I can remember an instance just about, I guess it was a year and a half ago, when in our case, because we cover state politics so heavily, when Chris Christie was about to bow out of, I guess it was really 2 years ago, was about to bow out of, from having run in the primary for the presidential race. And he held a really quick press conference, called this press conference, sent out a media alert. It was going to be within an hour, so everyone was scrambling. It was to announce that the State House was going to be undergoing a major historical renovation. It had nothing to do with the fact that he was, running for president or getting out of, he lost the primary, as we all assumed. So several people wrote headlines, Christie trolls the media. And so this was a really clever way of being true to what was actually happening, because he knew, his communications team knew what they were doing. And then in the story you go into, okay, he called this last minute press conference. Here's what we usually think when something like this happens. It's a major breaking news event. So you can still be punny, and if you have that swag in your writing and your journalistic style of reporting, you can still do those things as long as you're factual and go through explaining every element.
So facts, I know, are pretty much the primary building blocks of any news story. Is there anything else that you would consider to be, say, a golden rule of news writing journalism?
I would say, for sure, know your voice, know your audience, find your voice. When you're starting out as a writer, and I struggled with this, we typically copy what we've seen done before, not necessarily the exact writing, but we find a style that resonates with us, or someone, for me in broadcast, whose storytelling really hits me and I feel is something that speaks to me and speaks to how I want to convey myself. And we tend to emulate that and copy that in ways. That's just part of everything that we've learned and how we learn as people. So finding what works for you. My personality just may not be the same as someone who's really good at being somewhat almost like a sarcastic undertone to their writing that can come off quite humorous. I'm not good at that, so I don't do that because that's not me. So finding your voice, I would also say understanding your topics really well. That's not always easy when you're a general assignment reporter and you're reporting on a different topic every day, but knowing something about everything is really helpful, because when you get into this field, everybody can write. So you have to find a way to write that's a little unique to you, because and I know, we all know, the reason we follow a certain journalist or watch or listen to certain reporters is because we like how they present the information, whether that's aesthetically pleasing as you're reading it or as you're consuming it, or how it sounds, how their voices sound, how they fluctuate in their voices and punch certain words. So finding that voice and then really understanding the topic, because you're going to explain something so much better when you are comfortable with it and you yourself understand the ins and outs, just like you would. We always talk about being conversational in journalism, another difference between journalistic and academic writing. When you're conversational, that information is so much more easily retained by anyone who's consuming it. And knowing the subject helps you to be that much more conversational.
It's almost like trying to teach a class using a Skype conversation or something like that.
I bow down to you. You have a live audience at all times when you do that.
Yeah. So who are some of the people that you look to try and find your voice? If you had writers or journalists that you could recommend if students are looking for someone to be inspired by, who might that be?
When I was in college, it was recommended to me that I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And I thought that was really interesting because I didn't really know what that had to do with my journalism classes at the time. And then I realized through reading it that the whole concept of the book is it's giving this human element, this really empathetic style of writing to these very serious issues of poverty and race and culture. So it taught me that just because you're a journalist, it doesn't mean that you lose all heart and humanity because you're so focused on facts. You need to give human elements to everything you're writing about. So, one of my favorite, current writers who I always read whenever he has something new out is Paul Krugman. He writes for the New York Times. He writes a lot about the economy, but he writes about it in a way that I am not an expert in economics. I don't find myself to be particularly savvy in business journalism and writing, but I love his style because it's very catchy. I feel like I'm sitting down with him and having a beer and talking about these issues, talking about cryptocurrency, which I know very little about. He's just very relatable. I would recommend to anyone who's looking to go into writing to read William Zinsser's book on writing well.
Okay.
And I grabbed it from my nightstand because I always keep it there because I read it all the time.
You're serious.
Other 7 books that I'm reading. I read a lot of books at the same time. It not only gets you to understand what makes active voice, present voice so important for journalistic writing, but it helps you to realize that you are a creative writer in your own right. I'm really into health journalism. So I belong to this group with the USC Annenberg School in California, and it links me to local writers. So yesterday, I think it was, I was reading something from the San Antonio Times. It links me to local writers who are beat reporters in the health field. And that, for me, is really helpful because depending on where you are in the country, it's actually really interesting how different styles are.
Oh, yeah.
And I find a lot of international writing, too. There's a lot of amazing journalists in India and other places. So I try to just keep my reading varied. And I personally like reading other local reporting. And when I say local, I mean these writers in Chicago. I mean, these are big publications, but it helps me to understand how they're relating to their audience.
You mentioned trying to retain some sort of flourish and creativity in your writing. But at the same time, I imagine you also have to try and not be overly flourishy and flowery in your language. Is there any tips you can offer for how to remain concise and on point, but still not sound dry and robotic?
Write less.
Write less. Okay.
No,
nice, concise answer. Good.
When I sit down with interns and I have them put a package together with me, we go out in the field, we shoot all of our interviews, all of our footage, our B-roll, we call it, and we come back to put it together. I'll say to them, put together your own script, and then come and sit with me, and I'll show you what I wrote, and we're going to work together on putting together your own package. So what I find is 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, they have put maybe 10 sentences for each paragraph, for each section of information. Whereas in news writing, you really only need 1 to 3 sentences max. And these are not your elaborate, very flowery, like you said, writing. This is very, subject, verb, object, present, active voice sentences. So I often play a game when I come and speak with classes called Tell Me the Story in 3 sentences or less. So I'll give them a topic, I'll give them an article, something to read, a news story on TV, whatever it is, and say, okay, take 5 minutes, write down 3 sentences, and tell me that story in that many or less. And it's a really good exercise because it helps you to weed out and pull out the information that is absolutely critical and that which you can get to later in the story. It doesn't mean you won't get to it at all, but you can get to it later. And it's also really helpful in weeding out a lot of extra words. When we are taught all throughout our academic life, we overwrite, I think, when we're doing those, because we need so much explanation of how we got to that conclusion. Whereas in journalism, you've got the conclusion because you've just interviewed that source and they've just said it in their quote. So doing activities like that really help you to realize what words are needed. You don't need to add in all these extra adjectives and things that do make the piece stand out and help you to be there in that scenario, but you can probably get there with just one or two.
I'd imagine that also helps in terms of trying to write leads for your stories too, being able to summarize that way.
For sure. And the other thing I didn't mention is the other reason is we all have constraints on how long these stories can be. So for me, for a typical news story, it's 1:45 seconds. So think about just how quickly 1:45 seconds just passed for us. I have that much time to put together all these interviews and video I've collected from this story. Now for us, because I work for a PBS affiliate, we actually our low average is 2.5 minutes. So 2.5 to 3 minutes.
How luxurious.
Right, it is actually, but we're covering really wonky subjects. We're getting into the nitty gritty of a health policy or whatever it is. In digital writing, you have a certain length. So only having 2 or 3 sentences, 2 sentences for that lead, 1 sentence for that lead is really helpful because people tend to get bored scrolling and they see, now you can see how long that article is. And I see people in my own newsroom, oh, forget it, I don't have time for that right now. I'll just read the top nugget and go back to it later. So, you get cut off. Your editors say you have X amount of space. Now, that's changed now because, unfortunately, newspapers are, really being slimmed down. But in the advent, the heyday of newspapers, it was you have 12 lines, you have 15 inches. It's still very similar for web layout because there are advertisements and things that need to go on there. So you have to keep within that. So when you write your lead, you really want to hit what the base of that story is. You want to say, the fire happened yesterday and 12 people were killed. Well, that's kind of boring. So just because we're keeping it concise doesn't mean it also has to be boring. If that fire happened to include an elderly, 100-year-old woman or children or someone who's really a pillar of the community, that needs to go in your lead because that's what's going to grab readers. So you're thinking about, as a consumer, what's most important to me? I'm getting those, we talk about the 5 W's and an H. And that inverted pyramid style, having the bulk of your information at the top, the most important information, and going from there. But it's also, for me as a reader, and that's where I come back to knowing your audience, what's going to grab me? Why do I care so much about this?
So, which leads me to 2 really important questions. The first of which, speaking of 5 W's and 1 H, speaking of inverted pyramid, how much should we really care about AP style?
It depends. If you're an editor, you know that book like the back of your hand. As a broadcast journalist, I use it only in terms of grammar. My style when I write for me, for the broadcast, really includes none of it. But then when I need to put it on the web, I still need to know it because I need to understand that, oh, right, that's a hyphen that goes there. Oh, right, I need to make sure that I have my comma inside my quotation marks when I'm quoting someone.
Right.
So you need to know the fundamentals. It doesn't matter if you're going into broadcast or if you're going into magazine feature writing. You need to know those fundamentals. I got my first AP style book, I think, when I was a freshman or sophomore in college. I still have my original one that I marked up. I have a new one, but it's still marked up all those areas that I needed to understand to have those building blocks. So I think you have to remember that no matter what you're writing for, you shouldn't change the basics.
Good. That's reassuring as someone who's trying to teach the basics. And so then the other thing that comes up is you've mentioned a lot this transition from print to web and how you've had to adapt. So how have you had to adapt in with social media and new media and all of the changes in media culture that have come along in the way that you approach writing your stories?
You don't. You stay the same journalist you are. I think people forget that when they're getting on Twitter and they suddenly become a real sarcastic and trying to get as much information in as possible, and then it just doesn't make sense. You stay the same journalist. You make sure that whatever you're writing, whether it be for a quick Instagram post, whether I'm snapping something from the newsroom and I'm putting some type of caption with it, or if I'm using Twitter. And for journalists, I mean, Twitter is really our number one go-to. We rely on it as journalists for each other when breaking news is happening. And, they've actually changed it from being called a social media to now it's really considered a news platform. So you keep your same style, and you remember that even if you only have, they've extended it, but even if you have those 140 characters, you need to make sure that you're being really clear. There was an instance, I think, a few years ago with a CNN reporter who had tweeted something about Syrian refugees being filtered, and not as many would be allowed into the U.S. when a lot of these immigration policies were happening. And she wrote something about the Statue of Liberty bows her head in anguish, something like that. So that was her infusing her opinion about that. So you have to remember, just because it's Twitter, just because it's whatever social platform, you can't infuse your own personal beliefs into what you're putting out there. You still have to have those fair sides.
Yeah, still have to maintain some sort of brand consistency with what your audience is expecting of you.
100%.
Do you find that as you are in fact a real person, as opposed to just a journalist?
Not everyone thinks so when you're out in the field. You do have to remember when you're a journalist that there is a higher expectation of you, just like there is when you are someone, anyone who's, let's say, in law enforcement or whatever it is. There is a much higher bar that you have to maintain. But go ahead.
That's really interesting. But what I was going to ask was that, do you find there's actually any overlap of things that you do in your professional career in terms of media writing that you carry over into your personal online presence or your personal, I don't know, social media interactions, or I don't know if you blog on your own time or anything like that?
That's a great question. And I would say it does. It's changed the way I approach my own personal social platforms and those that I use for work. I keep a work Facebook page where I'll write about issues and sort of, engage with my audience. That's another really important thing, is when you are writing on any of Twitter, whatever it is, Facebook, you need to stay engaged with whomever it is your followers are. So I find that I am very active in whatever comments come from whatever I'm writing. If it's a post, almost like a blog post on my Facebook page, and there are folks commenting, even if they're somewhat trolling it, I'm very active in responding and explaining why certain views are this way, or why we interviewed certain people for a story. So I found that in my own personal life outside of Facebook, I've become much more conscious of how the information is presented. And I also have found that I've streamlined the way that I post. One really great sentence that leaves people wondering a little bit is going to get a lot more clicks and a lot more attraction than if I write, sort of this whole explanatory post right up front. So I've found that I've just myself become a lot more concise in my own social media writing.
Interesting. So one last question for you. I know you've worked a lot with students. You've led writing workshops for students. If there is one thing you find you either have to tell or wish you could tell every student who's trying to figure out how to write for journalism or for media, web media, what would that be?
Oh, boy, that's a tough one. Find what you are passionate about writing and write a lot of it. You're only going to get better if you do this every day. It doesn't matter who you're looking to work for, if you want nothing to do with broadcast, if you want to start your own blog. I know a lot of teachers who have actually, created their own path now because they started education blogs that got big followings, and now they comment, they're contributors for big time networks. Find what it is that you are really interested in and just start writing. As writers, we also tend to be procrastinators, and we love to wait until that deadline is up against us. But the more you do it, the more you're going to find your style, and you're going to find what works for you and what hits your audience. So write every day. That's what I tell everyone. Even if it's just social media posts, and I shouldn't say just, but you can really reach such an audience with that, and you can find what it is that you're really good at through doing those. Write every day. It doesn't have to be these long essays, the 5-paragraph standard essay of grammar school, but write and don't stop writing. It's just like anything. It's a craft. Anybody can do it. I promise you that. Anybody can do it. It's really about it's really about honing that craft, and any skill, any jack of trades will tell you, if you really practice something over and over again, you're going to excel at it.
Great. Well, I want to thank you very much for giving us this time and for all the insight you've provided. If someone wants to follow your work, where and how can they do that?
They can follow me at Bri Vannozzi, BriVannozzi, NJTV, at Bri Vannozzi, NJTV on Twitter. I also have a Snapchat, which is also Bri Vannozzi, and my Facebook page, which is Briana Vannozzi, and it's with NJTV News.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.